The gates of Rowanfield stables burst open before dawn, and Alara Whitmore ran barefoot across the frozen yard with her heart pounding in her ears. 3 men on horseback stood at the entrance, their coats stamped with the crest of the Thornfield family. She knew why they had come. She had known this day would arrive since the old master died 2 weeks before, but knowing did not make the fear any smaller. "Where is the horse?" the lead rider called out. His voice was sharp, used to being obeyed. "He is not for sale," Alara said, planting her feet firmly in the mud. "Not yet. Not like this." The rider laughed, a short and cold sound. "The new Duke does not ask. He commands. Every animal on this land belongs to him now, including that broken beast in the last stall." Alara felt her chest tighten. She had spent 3 years nursing that horse back from near death, and now strangers wanted to drag him away before the sun had even risen. She stepped between the men and the stable door, her arms spread wide, though she was no match for 3 armed riders on horseback. "Then let the Duke come himself," she said, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "Let him look the animal in the eye before he decides its fate." The men exchanged a glance. Something in her tone made them pause. After a moment, the lead rider nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "The Duke arrives within the hour. Pray your stubbornness is worth something, girl." They turned their horses and rode back down the frost-covered lane, leaving Alara standing alone in the cold, her breath rising in clouds around her face. She turned toward the stable, her legs shaking now that the danger had passed, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was warm, with the smell of hay and horse sweat. In the last stall, a black stallion stood pressed against the far wall, his eyes wide and wild, his ribs showing beneath a coat that had once been glossy and full. This was Ashfall, the horse nobody wanted, the horse she had refused to give up on since the day she found him half-starved and covered in old wounds in an abandoned field 3 years ago. "They are coming for you," she whispered, stepping slowly toward the stall. Ashfall's ears flattened, and he stamped one hoof against the straw, but he did not bolt. That alone was progress. A year ago, he would have thrown himself against the walls at the sound of a stranger's voice. Alara had grown up in these stables. Her father had been a groom here for 30 years, and she had learned to walk holding onto the mane of an old plow horse, before she learned to walk holding her mother's hand. When her father died, the old master, a kind and forgetful man named Edmund Thornfield, had allowed her to stay on as stable manager, more out of loyalty to her father's memory than any real need for her services. The stables had been failing for years. Most of the horses had been sold off one by one. The fences had collapsed in places, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. But Alara had stayed, because leaving would have meant abandoning the one place that still felt like home. Then Edmund Thornfield had died suddenly of a fever, and everything Alara knew had been thrown into uncertainty. His estate, including the stables and every animal within them, had passed to his nephew, a duke from the northern counties named Alaric Thornfield, a man Alara had never met but had heard described in whispers as cold, proud, and utterly without patience for sentiment. She sat down on an overturned crate near Ashfall's stall and pressed her palm flat against her knee to stop it from shaking. She thought of everything she had built here, fragile as it was. She thought of the horse in front of her, who trusted almost no one, who had learned to let her touch his neck only after months of quiet patience. She thought of what it would mean if a stranger's cart came to take him away to be sold for meat, simply because he was not pretty enough or fast enough to interest a nobleman at first glance. She would not let that happen, not without a fight. The hour passed slowly. Alara busied herself mucking out stalls and refilling water troughs, anything to keep her hands moving and her mind from spinning further into worry. She brushed down 2 old plow horses, checked the fences along the eastern paddock, and finally returned to stand near the stable entrance, just as the sound of hooves echoed down the lane once more. This time, only one rider approached, though he was followed by a modest carriage. The rider dismounted first. He was tall, dressed in a dark green coat with silver buttons, his boots polished despite the muddy road, and his expression carried the particular stillness of a man who rarely allowed his feelings to show on his face. Alara recognized him immediately, though they had never met. There was no mistaking a duke. "You are the girl who refused my men," he said, his eyes sweeping over her plain work dress and mud-stained boots. "I am the stable manager," Alara replied, lifting her chin. "Alara Whitmore, and you must be the new duke." Alaric Thornfield, he said simply, as though the name alone should end any argument. He glanced past her, toward the stable building, taking in its sagging roofline and cracked timber with open distaste. "This place is falling apart." I was told it was worthless, and I see now that I was told the truth. "It is not worthless," Elara said quickly. "It only needs care. It has been neglected, yes, but that does not mean it cannot be saved." The Duke's gaze settled on her, sharp and assessing. "And I suppose you intend to save it yourself?" "I have kept it running these past 3 years with almost nothing," Elara said. "I can do more, if given the chance." He walked past her without responding, stepping into the stable with the unhurried confidence of a man used to inspecting property he intended to dispose of. Elara followed close behind, her pulse quickening with every step he took toward the last stall. When he reached Ashfall's enclosure, he stopped. The stallion's ears pinned back immediately, and he backed into the corner of the stall, nostrils flaring, muscles tense beneath his thin coat. "This is the horse my men spoke of," the Duke said, his voice flat. "His name is Ashfall," Elara said. "I found him abandoned in a field 3 winters ago. He had been beaten and left to die. It took me the better part of a year just to get close enough to touch him, without him trying to bite or kick." "And what use is a horse that behaves this way?" the Duke asked, watching Ashfall's wild eyes with something close to contempt. "A horse that cannot be ridden, cannot be sold, cannot even be approached calmly, is worth nothing. He is a danger to anyone who comes near him, and a waste of feed besides." Elara felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sudden. He was not born this way. Someone made him this way, through cruelty. Given time and patience, he could become something extraordinary. I have seen glimpses of it already. Moments when he trusts me. Moments when he moves like no horse I have ever known. The Duke turned to face her fully now, his expression unreadable. "You speak with great confidence, for someone whose entire livelihood depends on my decision today." "I speak with confidence, because I have spent 3 years earning the trust of that animal. One small step at a time," Elara said, refusing to let her voice waver. "I know what he could become, even if no one else does." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. He studied Ashfall, then studied Elara, as though weighing 2 equally unlikely gambles. Finally he spoke. "I came here today to have this stable sold and that horse disposed of before the week's end. That was my full intention, and nothing I have seen has changed my opinion of this place's worth." He paused, and something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might have been curiosity, or might have been simple boredom, with the predictability of his own plans. "However, I find myself somewhat entertained by your stubbornness." Elara held her breath. "I will give you 1 chance," the Duke continued. "1 season. If, by the end of it, you can show me genuine progress with this animal, and genuine reason to believe this stable is worth the cost of keeping it running, I will reconsider my decision. If you fail, the stable will be sold immediately, the horse will be disposed of, and you will lose your position here without further argument. Do you accept these terms?" It was a harsh bargain, offered with the casual cruelty of a man who expected to win regardless of the outcome, but it was also the only chance Elara had been given, and she knew better than to waste it arguing over its fairness. "I accept," she said. The Duke studied her a moment longer, as though searching for doubt behind her words and finding none. "Very well. I will return in 1 season's time to see what you have made of this wager. Do not disappoint me, Miss Whitmore, though I confess I expect that you will." He turned and walked back toward his waiting carriage without another word, his boots striking the frozen ground in even, unhurried steps. Elara watched him go, her heart still racing, uncertain whether she had just saved everything she loved or simply delayed its destruction by a single season. Behind her, Ashfall shifted restlessly in his stall, sensing the tension that lingered in the air, long after the Duke's carriage had disappeared down the lane. Elara turned back toward him, took a slow breath to steady her hands, and stepped closer to the stall door. "It is just us now," she murmured. "1 season to prove what I already know. We will not fail. I refuse to let us fail." Ashfall's ears flicked toward her voice, and for the first time since the riders had arrived that morning, his stance eased just slightly, his weight shifting away from the corner of the stall. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who did not know him as well as she did, But to Alara, it felt like the first sign of hope she had been given all day. She spent the rest of that afternoon walking the boundaries of the stable grounds, taking stock of everything that needed repair, and everything that could be salvaged with the little money and fewer resources she had available. The fences along the northern paddock had rotted through in 3 places. The roof over the feed store leaked whenever it rained hard, ruining grain she could not afford to replace. The stable itself, though structurally sound, looked exactly as neglected as the Duke had judged it to be at first glance. But beneath the neglect, Alara saw what she had always seen: good bones, solid foundations, a place that had once been full of life, and could be again, if someone was willing to put in the work. As evening fell, she returned to the stable, and found the old stable hand, a weathered man named George, who had worked alongside her father years before retiring, due to a bad hip, waiting near the entrance, with a worried expression on his face. "Word travels fast in this county," George said, leaning heavily on his cane. "They say the new Duke came to see about selling the place." "He did," Alara admitted, sitting down on the bench beside him, "and he nearly took Ashfall away this morning, before he even arrived." "But you're still here," George said, glancing toward the stable behind them. "So something must have changed his mind." "Not changed it," Alara said, "delayed it. He gave me 1 season to prove this place is worth saving, and to prove that Ashfall is worth more than the meat on his bones. If I fail, everything ends. The stable, my position here, all of it." George was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. 1 season is not much time to tame a horse that took you 3 years to approach without fear. "I know," Alara said, the weight of it settling heavily in her chest, "but it is the only chance I have been given, and I intend to use every single day of it." "Then you will need help," George said. "More than an old man with a bad hip can offer, though I will do what I can. You will need feed, proper tools, perhaps another set of hands, strong enough to help with repairs. Where will such things come from, if the Duke has given you nothing but time?" It was a fair question, and one Alara did not yet have an answer to. She glanced toward the stable, toward the dim outline of Ashfall's stall visible through the open door, and felt the full weight of the task ahead of her settle over her shoulders like a heavy coat. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I will find a way. I always have." That night, after George had gone home, and the stable had grown quiet, except for the soft shuffling of horses, settling into sleep, Alara returned to Ashfall's stall one final time. She did not go inside, knowing better than to push too quickly, but she sat on the crate nearby and spoke to him softly, telling him about the day's events as though he could understand every word. "They wanted to take you away today," she said quietly, "but I would not let them. I never will, not as long as I have breath in my body to stop them." Ashfall stood near the front of his stall now, closer than he had been that morning, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern light in a way that almost looked like understanding. "We have 1 season," Alara continued, "1 season to show a Duke who has already decided we are worthless, that he is wrong about both of us. It will not be easy. It may not even be possible, but I intend to try with everything I have, because giving up was never something either of us knew how to do." The stallion lowered his head slightly, and though he did not step forward to close the distance between them, he did not retreat either. It was enough, for now, to know that he was listening, that somewhere beneath the fear and the old wounds, there remained a creature capable of trust. Alara stayed there long into the night, watching the horse who had become the center of everything she had left to fight for, and thinking of the cold, unreadable Duke who now held both their fates in his hands. She did not know yet what the coming season would bring, whether it would end in triumph or in the loss of everything she had spent her life building. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not stop trying until the very last day of the wager had come and gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the stable roof, carrying with it the first hint of the long, difficult season that lay ahead. Alara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and did not move from her place beside the stall, unwilling to leave Ashfall alone on a night that had already tested both of their courage more than either of them had expected. Somewhere beyond the stable walls, in a grand house she had never seen, the Duke, who had given her this fragile chance, was likely already forgetting about the stubborn stable girl and her broken horse, certain that the season would end exactly as he expected, with the sale of a worthless property and the quiet disposal of an unmanageable animal. He had no reason yet to believe otherwise. But Alara knew something he did not. She knew what patience could accomplish, given enough time and enough will. She knew what it meant to build something out of nothing, because she had done it once before with this very horse, coaxing trust out of an animal that the rest of the world had already given up on entirely. One season, it was not much, but it was enough to begin, and beginning was all Alara Whitmore had ever needed to change the course of everything that came after. The scream of splintering wood tore through the stable at midnight, and Alara bolted upright from the cot in the tack room where she had fallen asleep out of pure exhaustion. She grabbed the lantern beside her and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor, dread rising in her throat before she even reached the source of the sound. Ashfall had thrown himself against the stall door hard enough to crack one of the boards. He stood trembling in the corner, eyes rolling white, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. Something had spooked him badly, though Alara could not immediately tell what. "Easy," she whispered, forcing her voice to stay low and steady, despite her own racing heart. "Easy now. I am here." She did not enter the stall. She had learned that lesson the hard way months earlier, with a bruise on her ribs that had taken weeks to fade. Instead, she knelt just outside the door, making herself smaller, less threatening, and began to hum a slow, wordless tune that she had discovered calmed him during his worst moments. It took nearly an hour before Ashfall's breathing slowed and his legs stopped shaking. Only then did Alara notice the shadow of a fox slipping away through a gap in the fence at the far end of the paddock, and she understood what had triggered the horse's terror. A small animal, nothing more, and yet enough to send him into a panic that could have injured him badly against the walls of his own stall. She sat back on her heels and pressed her palm against her tired eyes. This was the reality of the bargain she had made. One season to prove that this horse, who could be undone by the shadow of a fox, was capable of greatness. Some days, the task felt impossible. By morning, she had repaired the cracked board and inspected Ashfall for injuries, finding thankfully only a minor scrape along his shoulder. George arrived shortly after sunrise, his cane tapping against the frozen ground, and took one look at her exhausted face before shaking his head. "You cannot keep watch over him every single night," George said. "You will run yourself into the ground before the season is even a month old." "I do not have a choice," Alara said, rubbing at the scrape along Ashfall's shoulder with a damp cloth. "If something happens to him, everything I have worked for is finished before it even begins." "Then let me help more than I have been," George said. "I may not have the strength I once did, but I can still keep watch through the night some evenings, and I can teach you things about training that even you may not know yet, things I learned working with difficult horses long before you were born." Alara looked up at him, grateful tears stinging unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I would welcome that more than you know." Over the following days, George shared with her techniques he had learned decades earlier, from an old horseman who had trained animals for the royal stables before falling out of favor with the nobility. Slow introductions to new sounds and sights. Consistent routines that gave a frightened animal a sense of safety. Small rewards for even the tiniest signs of calm behavior. None of it was quick or dramatic, but Alara began to notice real progress within the first 2 weeks. Progress that gave her hope, even as the enormity of the challenge ahead continued to weigh on her. It was on one such afternoon, while she was working with Ashfall in the small training paddock behind the stable, that she noticed a rider approaching along the lane. She recognized the fine black horse before she recognized its owner, and her stomach tightened as she realized the Duke had returned far sooner than she expected. He dismounted near the paddock fence and stood watching for several minutes without announcing his presence, his expression as unreadable as it had been during their first meeting. Alara continued her work, refusing to let his sudden appearance rattle her concentration, though she was acutely aware of his gaze following her every movement. "You did not tell me you intended to visit again so soon," she finally said, once she had led Ashfall back toward the stall and secured the gate. "I did not intend to," the Duke admitted, his tone carrying a note of something almost like surprise at his own actions. "I found myself curious whether you had already given up on this foolish endeavor." "I do not give up," Alara said simply, brushing dust from her hands. "Not on horses, and not on wagers I have chosen to accept." The Duke studied Ashfall for a long moment, noting perhaps the way the horse's ears, though still wary, no longer flattened immediately at the sound of a stranger's voice. It was subtle, a change most people would never have noticed, but Alara saw the slight shift in his expression, and knew he had noticed it too. "He seems less inclined to destroy the stall walls than he did during my last visit," the Duke observed. "He is learning that not every stranger intends to hurt him," Alara said. "It is a slow process, but it is working." "Slow," the Duke repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "I have men who could break a horse of his temperament within a fortnight, using methods far more efficient than whatever gentle patience you seem determined to practice." Alara felt her jaw tighten at the implication. "Breaking a horse and earning its trust are not the same thing, Your Grace. A horse that is broken through fear will always carry that fear beneath the surface, ready to resurface the moment it feels threatened again. A horse that learns to trust becomes something far more valuable, an animal willing to give everything it has because it chooses to, not because it has been forced into submission." The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly at her sharp response, and for a moment, Alara feared she had spoken too boldly to a man who held her entire future in his hands. But instead of anger, something closer to reluctant respect flickered across his features. "You speak as though you have thought about this a great deal," he said. "I have spent 3 years thinking of little else," Alara replied. "This horse deserves better than to be broken by force after everything he has already survived." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back toward Ashfall, who stood watching them both from within his stall with an alertness that seemed sharper, more present, than it had during their first meeting weeks earlier. "Tell me of his history," the Duke said finally. "How did such an animal come to be abandoned in a field, half-starved and beaten in the first place?" Alara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but decided that honesty was likely her best chance of earning any measure of the Duke's genuine interest rather than mere idle curiosity. "I found him 3 winters ago, on the far edge of my father's old hunting grounds," she said. "He had clearly belonged to someone once. His coat, beneath the mud and the wounds, showed signs of careful grooming in the past. But whoever owned him had abandoned him, likely because he had grown difficult to handle, perhaps due to mistreatment that came before I ever found him. I brought him here because I could not leave him to die, though I had no idea at the time whether he would survive the journey, let alone recover." "And he did survive," the Duke said. "He did," Alara confirmed, "though it took the better part of a year before he would allow me within arm's reach without attempting to bite or kick. Even now, there are moments when old fears resurface without warning, moments when the smallest sound sends him into a panic that reminds me how far we still have to go." The Duke considered this information carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, for the first time since Alara had met him. "You believe, despite all of this, that he could one day compete against horses bred and trained specifically for racing?" "I believe he has something most bred and trained horses will never possess," Alara said. "A will to survive that goes beyond mere training. I have seen him move, Your Grace, in moments when his fear falls away and instinct takes over entirely. His speed, his power. It is unlike anything I have witnessed in any other horse on this land. Speed and power mean little if the animal cannot be controlled during an actual race," the Duke pointed out. "A horse who panics at the shadow of a fox, as I understand happened only recently, is hardly suited for the noise and chaos of a competitive field." Alara's eyes widened slightly, surprised that word of the previous night's incident had already reached him. "How did you come to hear of that?" "I have people who report to me regarding matters on my properties," the Duke said simply, without further explanation. "It is my business to know what occurs on land that bears my name, even land I have not yet decided whether to keep." The reminder that her every action was being watched and reported sent an uncomfortable chill through Alara, but she forced herself to remain steady, unwilling to let him see how deeply the knowledge unsettled her. "The Fox incident was a setback," she admitted. "But setbacks are part of the process. He improves every single day, even when that improvement comes with occasional steps backward. I would ask that you judge him not by any single incident, but by the overall progress made across the full season you have granted me." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, before finally nodding once, briefly. "Very well. I will grant you that consideration, though I will continue to watch closely." Do not mistake my patience for anything resembling belief in your success, Miss Whitmore. I remain entirely convinced that this endeavor will end in failure. Then I look forward to proving you wrong, Elara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Something shifted in his expression then, something almost like the ghost of amusement passing briefly across his otherwise stern features. You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps I am simply someone who refuses to accept defeat before the contest has even begun, Elara replied. The Duke did not respond immediately, instead turning his attention back toward Ashfall, who had moved closer to the front of his stall during their conversation, his dark eyes fixed with unusual steadiness on the two figures standing beyond the fence. It was the longest Elara had ever seen him remain calm in the presence of a stranger, and she felt a small flare of hope kindle in her chest at the sight. He watches you as though he trusts you, the Duke observed quietly. He is beginning to, Elara said. It has taken 3 years to reach even this small measure of trust. I do not expect you to understand how significant that progress truly is. But I promise you, Your Grace, it is significant indeed. The Duke remained silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between the horse and the woman who had fought so fiercely to save him, before finally turning back toward his own horse, waiting patiently near the paddock fence. I will return again before the season's end, he said, mounting with the easy grace of a man raised in the saddle since childhood. See that you make full use of the time remaining to you. I intend to, Elara said. He rode away without further words, leaving Elara standing alone once more beside the paddock, watching his figure grow smaller down the lane, until it disappeared entirely from view. She let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, and turned back toward Ashfall, who nickered softly at her approach, a sound she had rarely heard from him before. He does not believe in us, she murmured, stepping closer to the stall. But that is all right. Belief will come, in time, once he sees for himself what we are capable of building together. Over the following weeks, Elara threw herself into the work with renewed determination, spurred on by both the ticking clock of the season and the unexpected wait of the Duke's occasional visits, which continued far more frequently than either of them likely anticipated at the start of their bargain. Each time, he claimed some practical reason for his presence: an inspection of the property, a concern regarding expenses, a need to verify her progress firsthand. But Elara began to suspect, though she never voiced the thought aloud, that his true reasons ran deeper than mere practicality. George continued teaching her patience-based training methods, and slowly, painstakingly, Ashfall began to change. He allowed her to place a light saddle blanket across his back without flinching. He tolerated the presence of other stable hands at a distance, though he still preferred Elara's company above all others. He learned to associate the sound of an approaching cart with feeding time rather than danger, a small shift that nonetheless represented enormous progress for an animal who had once panicked at the mere creak of a wagon wheel. But progress, Elara knew, was fragile. One bad incident, one moment of panic witnessed by the wrong person, could undo months of careful work in an instant. And as the days passed and the season slowly advanced toward its midpoint, she felt the weight of that fragility pressing down upon her more heavily with each passing week, aware that everything she had built could still, in a single unfortunate moment, come crashing down entirely. Rain hammered against the stable roof so hard that Elara worried the old boards might finally give way entirely, and she pressed herself against the wall of Ashfall's stall, trying to keep him calm as thunder rolled across the darkened sky outside. He had grown used to many things over the past weeks, but storms remained one of his greatest fears, a leftover terror from whatever cruelty he had endured before she found him. "Steady," she whispered, though her own voice trembled slightly with each crack of thunder. "It cannot hurt you. It is only sound and light, nothing more." Lightning flashed, illuminating the stable in a brief white glare, and Ashfall reared back against the far wall, his hooves striking the wood with a force that made Elara's heart lurch with fear for his safety. She did not retreat, though every instinct screamed at her to move away from the panicked animal. Instead, she lowered herself further, making her body as small and unthreatening as possible, and continued speaking in the same low, steady tone she had used since the storm began an hour earlier. It took nearly 2 hours before the worst of the storm passed, and Ashfall's trembling finally subsided enough for him to stand quietly near the front of his stall once more. Exhausted, Elara sat down against the wall opposite him, her clothes soaked through from where rain had leaked through a gap in the roof, directly above where she had been kneeling. It was in this state, drenched and utterly spent, that George found her the following morning, when he arrived for his usual visit. "You cannot continue like this," he said, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. "You will fall ill, or worse, injure yourself trying to manage him alone, through every storm and setback that comes your way." "I have no choice," Elara said, though even she could hear the exhaustion straining her own voice. "There is no one else who can calm him the way I can." "Then perhaps it is time others learned," George suggested. "I have a nephew, young Nathaniel, who has always shown a gentle way with frightened animals. He could help share the burden of watching over Ashfall during difficult nights, freeing you to rest properly, at least some of the time." Elara hesitated. Trusting Ashfall's care to anyone else felt like a risk she could not afford to take, not with so much resting on the outcome of this single season. But George's words carried a truth she could not ignore. She was running herself into the ground, and an exhausted trainer made mistakes that a well-rested one would not. "Bring him," she finally said. "Let me see for myself whether he has the patience this work requires." Nathaniel arrived the following day, a quiet young man, perhaps 18 years of age, with calm eyes and an unhurried way of moving that immediately put Elara somewhat at ease. She watched carefully as George introduced him to Ashfall from a safe distance, noting the way Nathaniel remained perfectly still, allowing the horse to approach at his own pace, rather than reaching toward him eagerly, the way so many newcomers instinctively did. By the end of that first afternoon, Elara felt confident enough in Nathaniel's gentle patience to allow him to take on some of the nighttime watch duties, giving her the first full night of proper rest she had enjoyed in weeks. The relief of shared responsibility proved immense, and she found herself grateful beyond words for George's suggestion. With Nathaniel's help easing her burden, Elara turned her attention toward a different aspect of the wager entirely, the physical state of the stables themselves. If she intended to convince the Duke that this property held genuine value beyond a single unpredictable horse, she needed to demonstrate real progress in restoring the buildings and grounds to a functional, respectable condition. She spent her days now divided between training sessions with Ashfall and repair work throughout the stable complex. With Nathaniel and George's combined help, they managed to patch the worst of the roof leaks, repair the collapsed sections of fencing along the northern paddock, and clear years of accumulated debris from the unused stalls that had once housed a much larger population of horses before the previous owner's decline. It was exhausting work, made harder by their limited resources, but Elara found a strange satisfaction in watching the stables slowly transform beneath their efforts. Each repaired fence post, each patched roof section, felt like another small victory against the Duke's initial dismissal of the property as worthless. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the eastern boundary of the property, Elara noticed a young woman approaching from the direction of the main road, dressed in fine traveling clothes that immediately marked her as someone of considerable means. Elara straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, uncertain what business such a visitor might have at these modest stables. "You must be Elara Whitmore," the young woman said as she drew closer, her tone friendly, despite the obvious gap in their social standing. "I am Charlotte Ashworth. My family's estate borders the Duke's northern properties, and word of your unusual wager has traveled rather quickly through certain circles." Elara felt a flicker of unease at the mention of her situation being discussed among the nobility, but she kept her expression neutral. "I did not realize my affairs had become a topic of interest beyond this property." Charlotte smiled, though something careful lingered behind the expression. The Duke Thornfield rarely takes personal interest in matters of business, particularly matters as small as a single stable and a single horse. His unusual attention to your situation has not gone unnoticed among those who know him well. I assure you, his interest is purely a matter of the wager itself, Elara said, though she found herself uncertain whether that was entirely true, given the frequency of his recent visits. Nothing more. Perhaps, Charlotte said, though her tone suggested polite disbelief. I merely wish to offer a word of caution, given as one woman to another. The Duke has a reputation for losing interest in matters quickly, once their novelty fades. I would hate to see you place too much hope in his continued goodwill. Elara studied the other woman carefully, sensing there was more beneath her seemingly friendly warning than simple concern for a stranger's welfare. "I appreciate your caution," she said carefully. "Though I assure you, my hopes rest entirely on the horse I am training, not on any goodwill from the Duke himself." Something flickered across Charlotte's face, quickly hidden behind a polite smile. "Of course. I only meant to be helpful. Good day, Miss Whitmore. I wish you success with your wager, whatever its true nature may be." She departed as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving Alara standing at the fence with a growing sense of unease. Something about the encounter felt deliberate, calculated in a way that suggested Charlotte Ashworth's true purpose had little to do with genuine friendliness. That evening, she mentioned the strange visit to George while they worked together mending a torn section of the stable's main door. "The Ashworth family," George said thoughtfully, setting down his tools. "They breed racehorses themselves, quite successfully. I imagine they would take considerable interest in any rumor suggesting a new competitor might emerge from an unexpected source." "You believe she came to assess whether Ashfall poses a genuine threat to her family's interests?" Alara asked. "I believe it is possible," George said, "though I would not concern yourself too greatly with her motives just yet. Focus on the work in front of you. Let the future concern itself with whatever obstacles it chooses to present." Alara took his advice to heart, though the encounter with Charlotte Ashworth lingered in her thoughts over the following days, a quiet reminder that her efforts here, however isolated they might feel, were being watched by more eyes than she had initially realized. The Duke returned again, roughly a month into the season, arriving unannounced as had become his habit, though Alara noticed his visits now carried a different quality than they had at the beginning. He no longer inspected the property with obvious disdain, but instead seemed genuinely curious about the progress being made, asking detailed questions about training methods and repair work that suggested real engagement rather than mere formality. The fences along the northern paddock looked considerably improved, he observed during one such visit, running a hand along a newly repaired post. "We have been working steadily," Alara said, unable to keep a note of pride from creeping into her voice. "There is still much to be done, but the worst of the damage has been addressed." "And the horse?" the Duke asked, his gaze shifting toward the training paddock where Ashfall stood, saddle blanket resting across his back without protest, a sight that would have been unimaginable only weeks earlier. "See for yourself," Alara said, gesturing toward the paddock. The Duke walked closer, watching as Alara approached Ashfall slowly, speaking softly, and gently adjusted the blanket across his back. The stallion's ears flicked toward her voice, but he remained calm. His weight settled evenly on all four legs, rather than tensed for flight. "Remarkable," the Duke murmured, and for the first time since their initial meeting, Alara heard genuine surprise rather than skepticism in his tone. "He has come far," Alara agreed. "Further than I believed possible in such a short time, if I am honest." The Duke turned to study her then, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Alara feel suddenly self-conscious beneath his attention. "You have accomplished more in a single month than I believed possible for this entire property." "Is that a compliment, Your Grace?" Alara asked, unable to resist a small smile. "Perhaps," the Duke said, the ghost of an answering smile touching his own lips briefly, before his usual composed expression returned. "Do not allow it to go to your head. There remains a great deal of season left, and I have yet to see this horse perform at anything resembling the speed and skill you claim he possesses." "Patience, Your Grace," Alara said, "all things in their proper time." He studied her a moment longer, before nodding once and turning to mount his waiting horse. "I will hold you to that patience, Miss Whitmore. Do not disappoint me." "I have no intention of doing so," Alara replied, watching him ride away with a growing sense that this wager, whatever its true stakes might ultimately prove to be, had become something far more significant than either of them had anticipated at its beginning. Dust rose in thick clouds from the old records room at the back of the stable office, and Alara coughed sharply as a stack of forgotten ledgers collapsed onto the floor at her feet, scattering brittle papers across the boards. She had been searching for anything that might help her understand Ashfall's origins more clearly, some clue buried in the old master's records that might explain where such a remarkable horse had come from before his abandonment. She knelt down and began gathering the fallen pages, her eyes catching on faded ink and yellowed parchment that looked far older than the recent stable records she had been sorting through moments earlier. Curious, she set aside her original search and began examining these older documents more closely. The handwriting was elegant, clearly the work of someone well-educated, and the dates at the top of each page stretched back decades, long before Alara had even been born. As she read further, her breath caught in her throat. These were breeding records, detailed accounts of a bloodline once kept on this very property, horses bred for speed and endurance beyond anything typically seen among common stock. And there, listed among the final entries before the records abruptly stopped, was a name that made her heart pound with sudden recognition. Emberwing, a black stallion described in careful detail as possessing extraordinary speed, intelligence, and a spirited temperament that required patient, dedicated handling. She read the description again, comparing it against everything she knew of Ashfall's own coloring. His temperament, the particular way he moved when fear did not hold him back. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Hands trembling slightly, she continued searching through the remaining pages until she found a final entry, written in a different hand than the earlier records, noting that the last of the Emberwing bloodline had been sold off following a change in the estate's ownership several decades earlier, the family having fallen into financial difficulty and been forced to disperse their most valuable holdings. Alara sat back on her heels, staring at the ancient pages in her hands, pieces slowly clicking together in her mind. If these records were accurate, if Ashfall truly descended from this legendary bloodline, it would explain everything. His extraordinary speed during the rare moments his fear did not hold him back, his innate intelligence despite his troubled past, the sheer presence he carried even in his most frightened states. She needed to share this discovery immediately, though she was uncertain how the Duke would react to learning that the horse he had once dismissed as worthless might actually descend from his own family's forgotten legacy. She sent word through George's connections in the nearest town, and within 2 days, the Duke arrived at the stables once more, his expression carrying a mixture of curiosity and impatience at having been summoned, rather than arriving purely on his own initiative. "Your message suggested urgent news," he said as he dismounted, studying her expectant expression carefully. "I trust this is not merely another attempt to secure additional resources for your repairs." "It is something far more significant than that," Alara said, leading him toward the stable office, where the old records lay spread across the desk, exactly as she had left them. "I found these while searching through your uncle's old papers. I believe they concern your family's history, far more than they concern mine." The Duke's brow furrowed as he stepped closer, examining the aged pages with growing interest. He read silently for several minutes, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something far more intense as he reached the entries describing the Emberwing bloodline. "This cannot be accurate," he murmured, though his tone suggested he was already beginning to consider the possibility seriously. "My grandfather's stables were legendary throughout the kingdom, decades before my time, though I confess I knew little of the specific details beyond family stories passed down through the years. The Emberwing line was said to be among the finest ever bred in this region, before financial troubles forced my grandfather to disperse the herd entirely. And Ashfall," Alara said quietly, "matches every physical description recorded here. His coloring, his temperament, even the particular manner in which the records describe his ancestors moving, when properly encouraged rather than frightened." The Duke set down the papers and turned to look at her, something unreadable moving behind his sharp eyes. "You believe this abandoned, half-wild horse descends directly from my grandfather's legendary bloodline?" "I believe it is entirely possible," Alara said. "Perhaps even likely, given the evidence before us. Someone in the years since your grandfather dispersed the herd may have continued breeding a small line privately, only for circumstances to eventually lead to Ashfall's abandonment, in that field where I found him." The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring down at the ancient records with an expression Alara had never seen him wear before, something almost vulnerable beneath his usual composed exterior. "My grandfather spoke of that bloodline often when I was a child," he said finally, his voice quieter than Alara had ever heard it. "He considered its loss one of the great tragedies of his life, greater even than the financial troubles that forced him to sell them off in the first place. He always believed that line represented something truly exceptional, horses capable of feats no ordinary breeding could produce." "Then perhaps," Alara said carefully, "Ashfall represents a chance to reclaim something your family believed lost forever." The Duke looked up at her then, and for the first time since their initial meeting weeks earlier, Alara saw something in his expression that resembled genuine hope, rather than mere skepticism, or calculated curiosity. "If this is true," he said slowly, "if this horse truly carries my grandfather's bloodline within him, then this wager has become something far more significant than a simple test of your training abilities, Miss Whitmore. It has become a chance to restore something my family lost generations ago." "Then we must ensure we do not fail," Alara said firmly. The Duke nodded, still studying the old records, with an intensity that suggested he was already turning the information over in his mind, considering its implications for the future. "I will need to verify these records against other family documents I possess at my main estate, but if what you have found here proves accurate, it changes a great deal about how I view this entire situation." "Does it change your opinion of the horse himself?" Alara asked, unable to fully hide the hope in her own voice. "It changes my opinion of what he might be capable of becoming," the Duke said carefully. "Whether that potential can actually be realized still depends entirely on the training you provide, and the season we have remaining to prove his worth. Bloodline alone means nothing without proper development, as I am certain you already understand." "I do understand that," Alara said, "but knowing his true heritage gives me something I did not have before. A deeper understanding of exactly what we are working to restore, not merely a frightened animal's basic trust, but a legacy your family believed had been lost forever." The Duke gathered the old records carefully, treating them now with a reverence that had been entirely absent from his manner during his first visit to these stables weeks earlier. "I will take these with me for further verification, if you have no objection." "None at all," Alara said, "though I would ask that you share whatever you discover, whatever the outcome may be." "You have my word," the Duke said, and something in his tone convinced Alara that this promise, unlike so many empty assurances she had heard from men of his standing throughout her life, would actually be honored. He departed shortly after, the old ledgers secured carefully within his saddlebag, leaving Alara standing alone in the stable office, with a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty churning within her chest. If the records proved accurate, everything about this wager had shifted in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Ashfall was no longer simply an abandoned horse she had rescued out of compassion. He had become something far greater, a living connection to a legacy the Thornfield family believed had been lost generations earlier. The weight of that realization settled heavily upon her shoulders as she made her way back toward the training paddock, where Ashfall stood grazing quietly in the afternoon sun, entirely unaware of the significance that had just been discovered regarding his own ancestry. "You may be more important than either of us ever realized," she murmured, approaching him slowly, watching as his ears flicked toward the familiar sound of her voice. "Let us hope we can live up to whatever legacy runs through your blood." Ashfall lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with an alertness that seemed, in that quiet afternoon light, to carry something almost like understanding, as though some part of him already sensed the significance of the discovery that had just been made regarding his own forgotten history. Over the following days, Alara found herself training with renewed purpose, no longer working simply to save a stable and satisfy the terms of a wager, but working to honor a legacy she now understood carried genuine weight within the Duke's own family history. Every session in the paddock felt different somehow, charged with a sense of significance that had not existed before the discovery of those old breeding records. She wondered, as she worked, what the Duke was discovering at his own estate, as he searched through his family's documents for further confirmation of Ashfall's heritage. She wondered how such confirmation, if it came, might change the trajectory of everything she had been working toward these past weeks. And she wondered, though she tried not to dwell too long on the thought, what such a discovery might mean for the increasingly complicated relationship developing between herself and the man who held her entire future within his hands. Whatever answers awaited them both, Alara understood now that this wager had become something far larger than either of them had originally intended, a chance not merely to save a struggling stable, but to restore a legacy generations in the making, one careful step at a time. A crash echoed through the darkness, and Alara shot up from her cot, every muscle in her body tensing at the unmistakable sound of the stable door being forced open. It was well past midnight, the kind of deep, silent hour when nothing should have been stirring except the horses themselves. She grabbed the lantern beside her bed and moved quickly, but quietly, toward the source of the noise, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the darkness, she saw a figure crouched near Ashfall's stall, one hand reaching toward the latch that secured the door. Fear and anger surged through her in equal measure, and she raised her voice sharply, before she had even fully considered the risk of confronting an intruder alone. "Stop right there!" The figure startled, spinning toward her voice, and in the dim lantern light, Elara recognized the face of a man she had seen only once before, standing at a distance during a market day in town, a groom known to work for one of the region's more prominent racehorse breeders. "You have no business here," Elara said, holding her lantern higher, wishing desperately that she had thought to bring anything resembling a weapon, before rushing toward the sound of danger. The man said nothing, his eyes darting toward the stable's rear entrance, as though calculating his chances of escape. Ashfall, sensing the tension and unfamiliar presence so close to his stall, began stamping nervously, his earlier fear of strangers resurfacing in an instant despite the months of careful progress they had made together. "Whatever you intend to do to that horse," Elara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite her racing pulse, "I will not allow it." The intruder finally spoke, his voice low and edged with something between nervousness and defiance. "You should have sold this place when you had the chance. Some people do not wish to see an unknown horse succeed where their own carefully bred animals have struggled." Before Elara could respond, the man bolted for the rear entrance, disappearing into the darkness beyond the stable walls before she could stop him. She did not pursue, unwilling to leave Ashfall alone and frightened in the aftermath of the intrusion. Instead, she rushed to his stall, speaking softly, trying to calm the panic that had gripped him during the brief but frightening encounter. It took nearly an hour before he settled enough for her to check him thoroughly for injuries, finding thankfully that the intruder had not managed to harm him before her interruption. But the implications of what had just occurred settled over her with a growing sense of dread. Someone, somewhere, viewed Ashfall's progress as enough of a threat to send someone creeping through the darkness with clearly malicious intent. She did not sleep again that night, choosing instead to remain beside Ashfall's stall until dawn broke over the horizon, at which point she immediately sent word to George, explaining what had occurred. "This confirms what I suspected weeks ago," George said grimly, examining the forced door for any additional clues regarding the intruder's identity. "Word of your progress with Ashfall has spread further than we realized, and not everyone views that progress favorably." "But why would anyone care enough to risk breaking into these stables in the middle of the night?" Elara asked, still shaken from the encounter. "Because horse racing among the nobility is not merely a sport," George explained. "It is a matter of pride, reputation, and often considerable wealth. Established breeders who have spent generations building their reputations do not welcome the sudden emergence of an unknown competitor, particularly one connected to a bloodline as legendary as the one you discovered in those old records." Elara felt a chill settle over her at his words. If word of Ashfall's true heritage had already spread beyond the Duke's own family, the danger facing them both had grown far more serious than she had initially realized. She sent word to the Duke immediately, and he arrived within hours, his expression darkening considerably as she recounted the events of the previous night. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying a hard edge Elara had not heard from him before. "I will have this matter investigated immediately. Whoever is responsible will face serious consequences for their actions." "Do you have any suspicion who might be behind it?" Elara asked. The Duke's expression turned thoughtful, though clearly troubled. "There are several breeding families in the region who would view Ashfall's success as a direct threat to their own standing, particularly if word of his true bloodline has spread as you suggest. The Ashworth family in particular has built their entire reputation around dominance in regional racing circuits for the past 2 generations." Elara thought immediately of Charlotte Ashworth's strange visit weeks earlier, her carefully worded warnings that had felt calculated rather than genuinely friendly. "I received a visit from a young woman claiming that surname some time ago. She seemed unusually interested in the details of our wager." The Duke's jaw tightened at this information. "I will look into the matter personally. In the meantime, I will arrange for additional security around these stables, at my own expense, to ensure nothing like last night's incident occurs again." "That is generous of you, Your Grace," Elara said, genuinely surprised by the offer. "It is practical," the Duke corrected, though something in his tone suggested more than mere practicality motivated his decision. "I have invested considerable interest in this wager's outcome. I do not intend to see that investment sabotaged by cowards operating under cover of darkness." True to his word, The Duke arranged for 2 additional guards to patrol the stable grounds throughout each night over the following weeks, easing some of Alara's fears regarding further intrusion attempts, though the underlying tension of knowing powerful rivals viewed her success as a genuine threat never fully disappeared. Despite the added security, the atmosphere surrounding their efforts grew increasingly tense as word continued spreading throughout the region regarding the unusual wager taking place at the Thornfield stables. Whispers reached Alara through George and Nathaniel about rumors circulating in town, some suggesting that Ashfall was too dangerous to ever be properly trained, others claiming that Alara herself lacked the genuine skill necessary to develop a horse of such supposed pedigree. She tried not to let the rumors affect her work, focusing instead on the steady, measurable progress she continued making with Ashfall each day. He now allowed a saddle to be properly secured across his back without protest. He tolerated brief periods of riding at a slow walk, though cantering or any faster pace still triggered enough anxiety that Alara knew significant work remained before he could handle the demands of actual racing conditions. One afternoon, as she worked him through a series of calm walking exercises in the training paddock, she noticed a small group of riders passing along the distant road, slowing their horses noticeably as they observed the training session from a distance. She recognized none of their faces clearly, but something about their prolonged interest set her nerves on edge, a reminder that they remained under constant observation from parties whose intentions she could not fully trust. That evening, as she discussed the day's events with George over a simple dinner in the stable office, he shared troubling news he had gathered during a visit to the nearest town earlier that day. The Ashworth family has been making inquiries about the King's Cup qualifying requirements, George said grimly. Word suggests they intend to ensure no unknown horse, regardless of bloodline, manages to qualify for entry without facing significant obstacles along the way. What kind of obstacles? Alara asked, dread pooling in her stomach. I do not know the specifics, George admitted, but families with their level of influence often find ways to complicate matters for those they view as unwelcome competition, whether through official channels or less official means, as we already experienced firsthand with the break-in attempt. Alara sat back, processing this new information with a growing sense of the mounting challenges ahead. It was no longer simply a matter of training Ashfall to overcome his own fears and limitations. She now faced the additional burden of navigating deliberate interference from powerful rivals determined to see their efforts fail before they even reached the qualifying stages of competition. She thought of the Duke, of his growing investment in this wager that had begun as a simple test of her abilities but had transformed into something far more personal, given the discovery of Ashfall's connection to his family's legacy. She wondered whether his involvement, however well-intentioned, might actually place her in greater danger by drawing further attention to their efforts from those determined to see them fail. But retreat was not an option she was willing to consider. Too much had already been invested, too much progress already made, for her to abandon this path, simply because it had grown more dangerous than she initially anticipated. We will need to be more careful, she said finally, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the small office. More careful with security, more careful with who we allow to observe our training sessions, more careful with every step we take from this point forward. Agreed, George said. Though I fear, careful alone may not be enough to overcome determined opposition from families with the resources and influence the Ashworths clearly possess. Then we will simply have to be better than careful, Alara said, a fierce determination settling over her, despite the mounting obstacles ahead. We will have to be undeniable. Outside, the evening settled into full darkness, and somewhere beyond the stable walls, guards the Duke had arranged began their nightly patrol, watching for any further sign of intrusion or sabotage. Alara returned to Ashfall's stall one final time before retiring for the night, finding him standing calmly near the front of his enclosure, apparently unaffected by the growing tension that had settled over the humans working so hard to secure his future. They wish to see us fail, she murmured, reaching out slowly to stroke his neck, a gesture he now accepted without hesitation. But we have come too far to allow that to happen. Whatever obstacles they place before us, we will find a way through them together. Ashfall leaned slightly into her touch, a small gesture of trust that, despite everything threatening their progress from outside forces, reminded Alara exactly why this fight remained worth every risk and every sleepless night it continued to demand from her. The letter arrived sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, and Alara's hands trembled slightly as she broke it open, sensing trouble before she had even read a single word. The message inside was brief, formal, and utterly damning. It announced a gathering of regional breeding families scheduled within the week, a meeting called specifically to discuss what the letter described as growing concerns regarding the legitimacy and safety of allowing an untested horse of questionable temperament to seek entry into the qualifying rounds for the prestigious King's Cup. She recognized immediately what this meant. The rumors and quiet interference she and George had discussed weeks earlier had escalated into something far more organized and dangerous, an attempt to formally block Ashfall's path before he ever had the chance to prove himself on the actual track. She rode immediately to inform the Duke, arriving at his grand estate for the first time since their wager began, feeling profoundly out of place among the polished stone and carefully manicured grounds that surrounded his ancestral home. A servant led her to a study, where the Duke sat reviewing documents at a large wooden desk, his expression shifting to surprise and then concern as she entered. "This is unexpected," he said, rising from his chair. "What has happened?" Alara handed him the letter without a word, watching his expression darken as he read through its contents. When he finished, he set it down on the desk with more force than necessary, his jaw tight with obvious anger. "They intend to petition against Ashfall's eligibility before he has even had the chance to compete in a single qualifying event," the Duke said, his voice carrying a cold fury Alara had not witnessed from him before. "This is precisely the kind of underhanded maneuvering I would expect from families more concerned with protecting their own reputations than with genuine fairness in competition."
"What can we do?"
Alara asked, the weight of the situation pressing heavily upon her. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the letter, as though searching for some solution hidden within its formal, hostile language. "The gathering they describe carries no official authority to bar Ashfall's entry, not truly. Eligibility for the King's Cup qualifying rounds is determined by established rules regarding a horse's health, age, and basic training, rules that Ashfall meets entirely, regardless of his more complicated history. But if enough influential families raise objections," Alara said, "surely that carries weight, regardless of official rules." "It carries weight only if I allow it to," the Duke said firmly. "And I do not intend to allow rumor and jealousy to determine the outcome of a wager I have chosen to honor." "You intend to attend this gathering yourself?" Alara asked, surprised. "I intend to attend and make my position on this matter unmistakably clear," the Duke said. "My family's name still carries significant influence in this region, whatever petty maneuvering the Ashworths and their allies believe they can accomplish against us." Alara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at his determination. Relief, because his willingness to publicly defend their efforts represented a level of commitment she had not fully expected when this wager first began. Apprehension, because such a public stand would undoubtedly draw even greater attention and scrutiny toward their already fragile progress. "Are you certain this is wise?" she asked carefully. "Standing so publicly against families of considerable influence carries risks for your own reputation as well." The Duke met her gaze steadily. "I have spent my entire life cautious of risking my family's reputation on anything uncertain. But watching you these past weeks, watching the genuine progress achieved through patience and determination, rather than mere force or privilege, has convinced me that some risks are worth taking, regardless of the consequences to my own standing among my peers." Something in his words struck Alara deeply, and she found herself momentarily unable to respond, moved by a sincerity she had not expected from a man she had once believed entirely cold and calculating. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for believing in this, even when the easier path would be simply to let the wager fail quietly and avoid the conflict entirely." "I do not believe in easy paths, Miss Whitmore," the Duke said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips briefly. "I have come to believe in results, and the results you have achieved with that horse speak for themselves, regardless of how loudly certain families object to their existence." The gathering took place 3 days later, at a grand hall belonging to one of the region's most influential breeding families. Alara accompanied the Duke, feeling deeply out of place among the assembled nobility, many of whom regarded her with open curiosity or thinly veiled disdain as she entered the room at the Duke's side. Charlotte Ashworth stood near the front of the gathered crowd, alongside an older man Alara assumed to be her father, both wearing expressions of confident superiority that suggested they anticipated an easy victory in whatever discussion was about to unfold. The Duke wasted no time addressing the assembled crowd once the formal proceedings began. "I understand concerns have been raised regarding the eligibility of a horse currently being trained on my property," he said, his voice carrying easily across the grand hall. "I would like to address those concerns directly, before any further rumor or speculation clouds what should remain a straightforward matter of established competition rules." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Alara felt her pulse quicken as every eye in the room turned toward them. "The horse in question," the Duke continued, "meets every established requirement for entry into the King's Cup qualifying rounds. His age, his health, his basic training, all satisfy the criteria set forth by the competition's official rules that have governed this event for generations, without requiring additional approval from any private gathering of concerned families." "With respect, Your Grace," Charlotte's father interjected, his tone carrying a thin veneer of politeness over obvious hostility. "The animal in question has a documented history of extreme unpredictability. Surely the safety of other competitors and their mounts must factor into any consideration of his eligibility." "The horse's history is well documented, and his recent progress equally so," the Duke countered smoothly. "I have witnessed firsthand the significant improvement achieved through careful, dedicated training. To bar his entry based on outdated concerns regarding his past behavior rather than his current, demonstrated capabilities would set a troubling precedent for how this region treats horses and trainers who do not come from already established, wealthy breeding operations." The implication behind his words landed clearly among the assembled crowd, and Alara noticed several faces shift with uncomfortable recognition at the accusation of favoritism toward established families over newer, less connected competitors. "Perhaps," Charlotte spoke up now, her earlier friendliness during their previous encounter entirely absent from her current tone. "The true concern is not the horse's temperament, but rather the legitimacy of claims regarding his supposed bloodline. Surely, such extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof before they should be taken seriously." This, Alara realized, was the true heart of their objection. Word of Ashfall's connection to the Emberwing line had indeed spread, and the established families gathered here viewed that claim as a direct threat to their own carefully cultivated reputations, built over generations of exclusive breeding. The Duke turned to Alara then, a silent question passing between them. She understood immediately what he was asking, and she nodded once, granting her permission for him to proceed. "I have in my possession documented breeding records from my own family's estate," the Duke announced to the gathered crowd. "Records confirming the existence of the Emberwing bloodline decades ago, along with clear physical and behavioral descriptions matching the horse currently in question. I am prepared to have these records examined by any independent expert this assembly wishes to appoint, provided such examination occurs promptly, without further delay to legitimate qualifying opportunities." Silence fell over the grand hall as the assembled families absorbed this unexpected development. Alara watched Charlotte's expression shift from confident superiority to something closer to genuine uncertainty, clearly not having anticipated such concrete evidence supporting claims she had likely dismissed as mere rumor or exaggeration. After several tense moments of quiet deliberation among the gathered families, an older gentleman near the back of the hall finally spoke, his tone carrying the weight of long-established authority within these breeding circles. "If such records exist and can be verified, I see no legitimate grounds for barring the horse's entry into qualifying rounds based on eligibility concerns alone. Any further objections regarding his temperament will be settled adequately by his performance, or lack thereof, during actual competition." Murmurs of reluctant agreement spread through the assembled crowd, and Alara felt a wave of relief wash over her, as the immediate threat to Ashfall's eligibility began to dissolve before her eyes. The Duke pressed his advantage further. "Then I trust this matter is settled, and no further attempts will be made to interfere with legitimate training or qualifying opportunities through underhanded means, whether through official objection or otherwise." His pointed gaze toward the Ashworth family left little doubt regarding his suspicion of their involvement in the earlier break-in attempt, though he stopped short of making a direct accusation without concrete proof. The gathering dispersed shortly after, the assembled families offering polite but noticeably strained farewells as they departed. Alara, and the Duke rode back toward the stables together in comfortable silence, the tension of the confrontation slowly easing from her shoulders as the reality of their success settled over her. "Thank you," she finally said, breaking the quiet between them, "for standing so firmly in our defense today." "I stood in defense of what is right," the Duke replied simply, "and in defense of the genuine progress I have witnessed with my own eyes these past weeks. That is not something I am willing to see undermined by petty jealousy, dressed up as legitimate concern." Ilara studied his profile as they rode, noticing the way the setting sun caught the sharp lines of his face, softening them slightly from the cold composure he typically presented to the world. "You have changed a great deal since our first meeting," she observed. "Perhaps," the Duke acknowledged, "or perhaps I have simply begun to see more clearly what genuine value looks like, beyond mere appearances or established reputation." Neither of them spoke further on the matter, though something unspoken had shifted between them during that ride back toward the stables, a growing understanding that this wager had evolved far beyond its original terms, becoming instead a shared commitment neither of them fully anticipated when their unlikely bargain first began weeks earlier. A sharp crack of a training whip echoed unexpectedly from beyond the paddock fence, and Ashfall bolted sideways so violently that Ilara nearly lost her grip on his lead rope entirely. Her heart hammered as she fought to steady him, glancing quickly toward the source of the sound, and finding Nathaniel standing frozen, his own expression horrified at having accidentally startled the horse during a routine exercise. "It is all right," Ilara called out, though her voice shook slightly as she worked to calm Ashfall's renewed panic. "Just an accident. Everyone remain calm." It took several long minutes before Ashfall's trembling subsided, his earlier progress momentarily undone by a single unexpected sound. Ilara felt a familiar wave of frustration and exhaustion wash over her as she considered how much work remained before the qualifying race, now scheduled only 2 weeks away. "I am sorry," Nathaniel said, approaching slowly once Ashfall had calmed sufficiently. "I did not mean to startle him so badly." "It is not your fault," Ilara reassured him, though privately she worried about how such incidents might unfold during the actual chaos and noise of a real qualifying race, filled with crowds, competing horses, and countless unpredictable sounds, far beyond anything they could fully replicate during training. This concern had grown increasingly urgent as the qualifying race approached, and Ilara had begun incorporating deliberately unpredictable elements into their training sessions, exposing Ashfall gradually to sudden sounds, unexpected movements, and larger crowds of onlookers in an effort to prepare him for the overwhelming sensory experience awaiting him during actual competition. Progress remained frustratingly inconsistent. Some days, Ashfall handled these challenges remarkably well, his confidence growing visibly with each successful exposure to new stimuli. Other days, like this one, an unexpected sound could send him spiraling back into old fears that Ilara had believed largely overcome weeks earlier. The Duke visited more frequently now as the qualifying race approached, his interest in their progress no longer disguised behind pretenses of practical business concerns. He arrived that same afternoon, finding Ilara still working to fully calm Ashfall following the earlier incident with the training whip. "Difficult day?" he asked, dismounting near the paddock fence. "Difficult, but not unexpected," Ilara admitted, walking Ashfall in slow circles to help release the last of his residual tension. "We are asking him to overcome fears that took years to develop, and expecting significant progress within mere weeks. Setbacks are simply part of that process." "The qualifying race is in 2 weeks," the Duke said, a note of concern coloring his usually composed tone. "Do you believe he will be ready?" Ilara hesitated, unwilling to offer false confidence, but equally unwilling to admit doubt that might further shake the Duke's already precarious faith in their efforts. "I believe he has made remarkable progress. Whether that progress proves sufficient for the actual demands of competition remains to be seen. There is only one way to find out for certain." The Duke studied her carefully, seeming to sense the underlying uncertainty she was trying carefully to disguise. "You are worried." "I am realistic," Ilara corrected gently. "This has never been a guaranteed path to success. I have always understood that possibility of failure remained real, regardless of how hard we worked toward a different outcome." "And if he fails during the qualifying round?" the Duke asked quietly. "What then, for both the wager and for him personally?" Alara considered the question carefully before answering. Then we will have still accomplished something remarkable, regardless of the final outcome. A horse who was once so broken by fear that he could not tolerate a stranger's presence, now tolerates a saddle, a rider, and increasingly chaotic surroundings without descending into complete panic. That progress matters, Your Grace, regardless of whether it proves sufficient for the specific demands of the King's Cup. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with an expression that suggested genuine reflection rather than mere polite acknowledgement. You are remarkable, Miss Whitmore. I do not believe I have said that plainly before, though I have thought it often these past weeks. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks at his unexpected words, uncertain how to respond to such direct praise from a man who had begun their acquaintance with such open disdain for everything she represented. Thank you, she finally managed. Though I would say the same of you, given how far you have come, from the man who first arrived here, intending to sell this entire property without a second thought. Perhaps we have both changed a great deal since that first meeting, the Duke said, something warm, entering his usually composed expression. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching along the lane, and both turned to see a young rider dismounting hurriedly, clearly having traveled some distance in haste. Your Grace, the young man said, breathless from his ride. I bring news from the qualifying committee. They have moved the date of the first qualifying round forward by 1 week, citing scheduling conflicts with several other regional events. Alara felt her stomach drop at this news. 1 week less than they had already been counting on. 1 week less to prepare Ashfall for the overwhelming sensory demands of actual competition. This seems remarkably convenient timing, the Duke said, his expression darkening with immediate suspicion. Do you know who specifically requested this change? I was told several prominent breeding families petitioned for the adjustment, the young messenger said, citing concerns about weather conditions later in the season. The timing felt far too coincidental to Alara, coming so soon after their confrontation with the Ashworth family and their allies at the gathering weeks earlier. This felt less like genuine scheduling necessity and more like a final, desperate attempt to undermine their preparation before Ashfall ever had the chance to prove himself. We will simply have to adjust our preparation accordingly, Alara said, forcing determination into her voice, despite the anxiety churning within her. 1 week less is not insurmountable, however unwelcome the timing may be. The Duke nodded, though his expression remained troubled. I will investigate whether this change was made through legitimate means or through further underhanded interference. In the meantime, focus entirely on preparing Ashfall as thoroughly as possible within whatever time remains. Alara threw herself into the remaining days with renewed intensity, working with Ashfall from dawn until well past dusk each day, gradually increasing the complexity and unpredictability of their training exercises. Nathaniel and George assisted wherever possible, creating artificial crowds through gathered neighbors and farmhands, generating sudden noises through carefully controlled means, and simulating as closely as possible the chaotic atmosphere Ashfall would face during actual competition. Progress remained inconsistent, but generally trending upward, each small victory building upon the last, despite occasional setbacks that tested Alara's patience and resolve. By the week's end, Ashfall could tolerate a crowd of nearly 20 people gathered around the paddock fence, could withstand sudden loud noises without complete panic, and could maintain a controlled canter, even amid moderate chaos and distraction. It was not perfect. Alara knew this, but it represented genuine, measurable progress from where they had begun mere months earlier, and she allowed herself small moments of cautious hope as the qualifying round drew ever closer. The night before the qualifying race, Alara found herself unable to sleep, standing instead beside Ashfall's stall long after the rest of the stable had settled into quiet darkness. He stood calmly, his earlier fears of the dark and unfamiliar sounds largely overcome through months of patient, dedicated work. Tomorrow, everything we have built together faces its first true test, she whispered, reaching out to stroke his neck gently. I know you carry fears that may never fully disappear, fears born from cruelty you suffered long before I ever found you. But I also know you carry something far greater within you, a strength and spirit that has already overcome so much more than anyone believed possible. Ashfall leaned into her touch, his breathing slow and steady, a far cry from the terrified, half-wild creature she had first approached in that abandoned field years earlier. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Alara continued, her voice thick with emotion she had been carefully suppressing for weeks, "know that you have already proven something remarkable, simply by surviving, by trusting again, after everything that was done to break that trust. Nothing that happens during the race itself can diminish what we have already accomplished together." She remained beside him long into the night, drawing comfort from his steady presence, gathering her own courage for the challenges that awaited them both when dawn finally arrived, and the true test of their months of careful preparation would finally begin. The roar of the crowd hit Ashfall like a physical wave the moment he stepped onto the qualifying grounds, and Alara felt him tense beneath her hands, his muscles coiling with the same fear she had worked so hard to overcome during months of careful training. Hundreds of spectators lined the fences surrounding the track, their voices blending into a chaotic wall of sound, unlike anything they had managed to replicate during practice sessions back at the stable. "Steady," Alara murmured, keeping her voice low and calm, despite her own racing heart, as she led him toward the starting gate, where other competitors were already gathering. "We have prepared for this. You are stronger than this fear." Around them, sleek, well-groomed horses pranced and pawed at the ground, their riders dressed in the fine colors of established, wealthy breeding operations. Alara felt keenly aware of how out of place they must appear among such polished competition. Ashfall's coat, still bearing faint traces of old scars despite months of careful grooming, herself dressed in simple, practical clothing, rather than the fine racing silks worn by her fellow competitors. She caught sight of Charlotte Ashworth nearby, mounted on a magnificent chestnut mare, her expression carrying poorly disguised contempt, as her gaze swept over Ashfall's still visible scars and Alara's plain attire. "I did not expect you to actually show your face here today," Charlotte called out, her tone carrying false sweetness over obvious malice. "Given the obstacles that seem to keep appearing in your path." Alara chose not to respond, focusing instead on keeping Ashfall calm amid the growing chaos surrounding the starting gate. She had learned enough during the preceding weeks to recognize provocation for what it was, an attempt to unsettle her focus before the race had even properly begun. The starting official called the riders forward, and Alara guided Ashfall into position, feeling his heart pounding rapidly beneath her legs, his ears pinned back with obvious anxiety, despite months of careful preparation. She leaned forward, whispering words of steady encouragement, drawing on every ounce of trust they had built together during their long journey toward this moment. The starting horn sounded, sharp and sudden, and Ashfall lurched forward with the rest of the field, his initial burst of speed impressive despite his obvious nervousness. Alara focused entirely on maintaining her balance and providing steady, reassuring guidance as they settled into the early pace of the race. For the first several furlongs, everything proceeded remarkably well. Ashfall's natural speed became immediately apparent, allowing him to keep pace easily with horses, bred and trained specifically for competitive racing throughout their entire lives. Alara felt a surge of hope as they moved through the early stages of the qualifying round, Ashfall's confidence growing visibly with each passing moment of successful competition. Then, disaster struck. As they approached the midpoint of the race, Alara noticed Charlotte's mare drifting unusually close to their position, closer than seemed accidental, given the ample space available on the track. Before she could react, the chestnut mare's rider deliberately allowed her mount to bump against Ashfall's shoulder, a subtle but clearly intentional maneuver that sent a jolt of fear through the already anxious stallion. Ashfall's old terror resurfaced instantly, his stride faltering as panic overwhelmed months of careful training in an instant. He began drifting sideways, nearly colliding with another competitor, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the unexpected physical contact and the resurgence of fears Alara had believed largely conquered. "Easy!" she called out, fighting to maintain her own composure despite the sudden crisis unfolding beneath her. "I am here. You are safe." She drew on every lesson learned during their long months together, lowering her voice to the same steady, calming tone she had used during countless training sessions, refusing to let panic infect her own responses, despite the very real danger of the situation. Gradually, achingly slowly, Ashfall's stride began to steady once more, his panic subsiding just enough for him to regain his footing and continue forward. Though the incident had cost them precious time and position within the field, they had fallen from a strong early position to somewhere near the middle of the pack, their earlier momentum severely disrupted by Charlotte's deliberate interference. Alara felt frustration and anger building within her chest, but she forced herself to focus entirely on the present moment, on continuing to guide Ashfall forward despite the setback they had just endured. There was still ground remaining before the finish line, still time to recover from this unexpected obstacle if she could keep her focus steady and her guidance clear. "We are not finished," she murmured, leaning forward to encourage him onward. "This is not how our story ends today." Something in her voice, in the steady confidence she projected despite her own racing fears, seemed to reach through Ashfall's residual panic, and gradually, remarkably, he began building speed once more, his powerful legs eating up ground with each passing stride, as they worked to close the gap that Charlotte's interference had created. They surged forward through the remaining furlongs, passing competitor after competitor, as Ashfall's true speed, the speed that had first convinced Alara of his extraordinary potential years earlier, finally began asserting itself fully. By the time they approached the final stretch, they had fought their way back into contention, though several strong competitors remained ahead of them, including Charlotte's mare, still holding a solid lead near the front of the field. The finish line loomed ahead, and Alara felt everything narrow down to this single, crucial moment. Months of patient training, of overcoming fear and cruelty and doubt, all converging toward this final stretch of ground between them and the conclusion of the qualifying round. "Now," she urged, giving Ashfall his head entirely, trusting fully in the bond they had built together over years of careful, dedicated work. "Show them everything you truly are." Ashfall responded with a burst of speed that seemed to defy his earlier panic entirely, his powerful stride lengthening as he surged forward with renewed determination. They closed the gap on the remaining leaders with astonishing speed, drawing even with Charlotte's mare just as the finish line came into view. The two horses crossed the line together, so close that for a long, breathless moment, Alara could not determine which of them had actually finished first. The crowd's roar seemed to fade into distant background noise as she waited, breathless and exhausted, for the official announcement that would determine everything. "By a nose," the announcer finally called out across the assembled crowd. "The qualifying spot goes to Ashfall, ridden by Alara Whitmore of Rowanfield Stables." Relief and disbelief crashed over Alara in equal measure as the crowd's reaction shifted from stunned silence to a mixture of cheers and grumbling discontent from those who had expected an established competitor to claim easy victory. She slid from Ashfall's back on shaking legs, pressing her forehead briefly against his sweat-soaked neck, overwhelmed by everything they had just accomplished together, despite the deliberate obstacles placed in their path. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Despite everything, despite every fear they tried to use against you, you did it." The Duke appeared moments later, having watched the entire race from the stands, his expression carrying an intensity Alara had never witnessed from him before. "That interference near the midpoint," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger, "was deliberate. I saw it clearly, and I intend to file a formal complaint with the racing officials regarding Miss Ashworth's conduct." "It matters little now," Alara said, though gratitude for his continued support warmed something within her chest. "We qualified despite their interference. That is what matters most today." "It matters because such behavior should not go unpunished," the Duke insisted. "But you are right, that today belongs to your victory, regardless of the obstacles placed against you." He paused, studying her with an expression that carried something warmer than mere professional interest in their wager's outcome. "You were remarkable out there, Alara. Truly remarkable." It was the first time he had used her given name without formal address, and Alara felt her heart flutter slightly at the small but significant shift in his manner toward her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in us, even when the path grew far more difficult than either of us anticipated." "I believe in you both entirely," the Duke said, his gaze steady and sincere. "And I look forward to seeing what you accomplish when the King's Cup itself finally arrives." Around them, the crowd continued dispersing, some offering congratulations, others casting resentful glances toward the unlikely victors who had defied every expectation placed against them. But Alara paid little attention to either reaction, her focus remaining entirely on Ashfall, on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment, and on the challenges that still awaited them as they prepared for the far greater test still to come. Thousands of voices rose into a deafening roar as Alara guided Ashfall onto the grand track reserved for the King's Cup itself. A sight so overwhelming in its scale that even her own steady nerves felt the sharp edge of fear beneath her calm exterior. Banners in every color imaginable fluttered above the crowded stands, and somewhere among the sea of faces, she knew the Duke watched with the same intense focus he had shown throughout every stage of their long journey together. Ashfall pranced nervously beneath her, his earlier training evident in how quickly he settled compared to the raw panic he might have displayed months earlier. But the sheer magnitude of this event dwarfed even the qualifying round they had already survived. This was the King's Cup, the most prestigious race in the entire kingdom, drawing competitors from every corner of the land, horses bred specifically for generations to compete at exactly this level. "We have faced worse than mere noise and crowds," Alara murmured, leaning forward to offer what comfort she could as they approached the starting gate. "We have faced cruelty, abandonment, and deliberate sabotage. This is simply one more challenge, no different in its essential nature, from everything we have already overcome together." She caught sight of Charlotte Ashworth's mare among the assembled competitors, and beside her, several other riders whose expressions carried the same practiced confidence of horses and trainers who had spent their entire lives preparing specifically for this moment. Alara felt the weight of their skepticism pressing against her, the unspoken certainty among many gathered here that an unknown horse and an unproven trainer had no legitimate business competing at this level. She refused to let that skepticism shake her own confidence, drawing instead on everything she and Ashfall had built together through months of patient, dedicated work. The starting horn sounded, its sharp blast echoing across the massive stadium, and the entire field surged forward as one, a thunderous wave of hooves and dust that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Ashfall responded immediately, his powerful stride carrying them quickly into the thick of the competition, holding pace easily with horses bred for exactly this purpose throughout generations of careful selection. The early stages of the race proceeded with brutal intensity, competitors jostling for position along the demanding course, each rider fighting fiercely for any advantage that might prove decisive during the race's final stretch. Alara focused entirely on maintaining Ashfall's rhythm, conserving his energy carefully for the demanding final furlongs still to come, while remaining alert for any sign of the deliberate interference they had encountered during the qualifying round. She did not have to wait long. As the field approached the halfway mark, she noticed Charlotte's mare maneuvering steadily closer, clearly intending to repeat the same tactic that had nearly cost them their qualifying spot weeks earlier. This time, however, Alara was prepared, having spent the intervening weeks working specifically with Ashfall on maintaining composure, amid close contact with other competing horses. As Charlotte's mare drifted toward them, attempting the same deliberate bump that had triggered such panic during their earlier encounter, Alara guided Ashfall smoothly to the side, avoiding the contact entirely through careful anticipation rather than reactive panic. Ashfall's stride remained steady, his confidence unshaken by the attempted interference, a testament to the additional training they had undertaken specifically to prepare for exactly this possibility. Frustration flickered briefly across Charlotte's face as her attempted maneuver failed to produce the desired disruption, and she fell back slightly, apparently reconsidering her strategy for the remainder of the race. The middle stages of the race tested every horse's endurance and every rider's skill, the demanding course winding through challenging terrain that separated genuine contenders from those whose early speed could not translate into sustained performance across the full distance. Alara felt Ashfall's breathing grow labored beneath her, the physical demands of the race finally beginning to test the limits of his conditioning, but his heart and determination remained unwavering, despite the mounting exhaustion. "Just a little further," she encouraged, feeling her own body ache with the physical strain of the demanding ride. "You have already proven everything they said was impossible. Show them what remains within you." As the field entered the final stretch, the true leaders of the race began separating from the rest of the pack, 3 horses pulling ahead, with obvious superior conditioning and raw speed built through generations of specialized breeding. Ashfall remained among this leading group, his powerful stride somehow finding additional reserves of energy despite the grueling distance already covered. Charlotte's mare held a narrow lead as they entered the final furlong, with 2 other prominent competitors close behind, and Ashfall trailing only slightly further back among this elite group, still fighting for the ultimate victory. Alara felt the crowd's roar building to an almost unbearable crescendo as the finish line finally came into view, the culmination of everything they had worked toward across the long months of their unlikely partnership. "Now," she urged, giving Ashfall complete freedom to draw upon whatever remained of his extraordinary spirit. "Everything we have built together comes down to this single moment. Show them who you truly are." Something remarkable happened then, something that would be discussed and remembered for years to come, among those fortunate enough to witness it firsthand. Ashfall found an additional gear of speed that seemed to defy the exhaustion evident in every other horse still competing for the lead, his powerful legs driving forward with a determination that transcended mere physical conditioning. He surged past the two trailing leaders first, then began closing rapidly on Charlotte's mare, who maintained her narrow lead through sheer determination as the finish line drew ever closer. The crowd's roar reached deafening levels as the two horses drew nearly even, their strides matching perfectly as they raced toward the conclusion of the most demanding competition either had ever faced. In the final desperate strides before the finish line, Elara felt Ashfall summon something extraordinary from deep within himself, a final burst of speed that seemed to carry the weight of every fear he had overcome, every moment of trust painstakingly built between them across years of patient work. He edged forward, inch by agonizing inch, until finally, in the last possible stride before the line, he pulled decisively ahead. They crossed the finish line first, Ashfall's victory unmistakable this time, no ambiguous photo finish required to determine the outcome. The crowd's reaction exploded into a chaotic mixture of stunned disbelief and thunderous celebration as the announcement confirmed what Elara already knew in her heart. "The winner of this year's King's Cup," the announcer's voice boomed across the stadium, struggling to be heard over the overwhelming crowd noise. "Ashfall, ridden by Elara Whitmore of Rowanfield Stables." Tears streamed freely down Elara's face as she slid from Ashfall's back, her legs barely able to support her weight after the physical and emotional intensity of everything they had just accomplished together. She pressed her face against his sweat-soaked neck, overwhelmed by a flood of emotion that encompassed every moment of their long journey together, from that first desperate rescue in an abandoned field to this extraordinary moment of ultimate triumph. "You did it," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You truly did it. Everything they said was impossible. You have proven entirely wrong." The Duke appeared moments later, pushing through the celebrating crowd with an urgency that suggested he could barely contain his own overwhelming emotion at witnessing their victory. When he reached them, he did not maintain his usual composed distance, instead reaching out to grasp Elara's hands firmly in his own. "You have accomplished something truly extraordinary today," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "Not merely a race won, but a legacy restored. A horse saved from certain destruction, transformed into something magnificent beyond anyone's expectations. We accomplished it together," Elara said, gesturing to encompass not merely herself and Ashfall, but everyone who had contributed to this remarkable journey. "You, George, Nathaniel, everyone who believed in what seemed like an impossible endeavor when we first began." The Duke's expression shifted, something vulnerable and sincere replacing his usual careful composure. "I confess, Elara, that my belief in this endeavor's success came far more slowly than my belief in you personally. Your determination, your patience, your unwavering commitment to a horse, and a cause that everyone else had already dismissed as hopeless, these qualities convinced me long before Ashfall's victory ever became apparent." Elara felt her heart racing, for reasons that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the race just completed, understanding clearly the deeper meaning behind his words. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now," the Duke said, "I find myself hoping this victory represents not an ending to our association, but rather the beginning of something far more significant between us, should you wish to explore where such possibilities might lead." Around them, the celebration continued unabated, spectators and fellow competitors alike drawn toward the remarkable story of an abandoned horse and his devoted trainer who had defied every expectation placed against them. But in that single moment, surrounded by chaos and celebration, Elara felt everything narrow down to the Duke's steady, sincere gaze and the possibility he had just offered her. "I would like that very much," she said softly, a genuine smile breaking through her earlier tears. "Though I suspect our partnership, in whatever form it ultimately takes, will remain every bit as demanding and unpredictable as the journey that brought us to this remarkable moment. I would expect nothing less, the Duke said, the warmth in his expression leaving no doubt regarding his sincere hope for what might lie ahead for both of them, together. Sunlight streamed through freshly repaired windows as Alara walked through what had once been the abandoned stables, now unrecognizable from the crumbling, neglected property she had fought so desperately to save less than a year earlier. New stalls lined both sides of the main building, each one occupied by horses, whose owners had traveled considerable distances specifically to breed their finest mares, with Ashfall, whose legendary bloodline and remarkable King's Cup victory had transformed Rowanfield stables into one of the most sought-after breeding operations in the entire kingdom. The Ellsworth family has requested another appointment, George said, approaching with a ledger full of inquiries that had continued arriving steadily since news of Ashfall's victory had spread throughout the region. They are willing to wait until spring if necessary, given how full our current schedule has become. Tell them we would be honored, Alara said, still finding it somewhat surreal how dramatically their circumstances had shifted since that desperate morning when Duke's men had first arrived, threatening to take everything she loved. George smiled, clearly sharing in her continued amazement at their remarkable transformation. Your father would be immensely proud, watching what you have built here from what seemed like certain ruin. Alara felt a familiar warmth at the mention of her father, whose quiet dedication to these very stables had first instilled in her the patience and determination that ultimately saved both the property and the horse who had become the foundation of their extraordinary success. I could not have accomplished any of this without your guidance and Nathaniel's steady help, Alara said sincerely. This success belongs to all of us equally. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a carriage approaching along the newly repaired lane, and Alara felt her heart lift with familiar anticipation as she recognized the Duke's distinctive vehicle, drawing closer to the stable entrance. Alaric emerged moments later, his expression carrying the warm openness that had gradually replaced the cold reserve she remembered from their very first meeting nearly a year earlier. Their relationship had continued deepening steadily throughout the months following Ashfall's remarkable victory, evolving from cautious professional partnership into something far more personal and meaningful for them both. I have news, he said, approaching with barely contained excitement evident in his usually composed demeanor. The royal court has formally recognized Ashfall's bloodline as an official addition to the kingdom's registry of legendary breeding lines, restoring the Emberwing name to prominence after decades of obscurity. Alara felt tears of genuine joy pricking at her eyes at this news, understanding fully the significance such recognition held, not merely for Ashfall himself, but for the legacy of the Duke's own family, that had believed this bloodline lost forever, generations earlier. Your grandfather would be overjoyed, she said softly. He would, Alaric agreed, his own eyes bright with emotion at the thought, though I suspect he would be equally proud of the remarkable woman who made this restoration possible through nothing but patience, determination, and genuine compassion for a creature everyone else had already given up on entirely. He drew closer, taking her hands gently in his own, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished over the months of their deepening relationship. I have given this considerable thought, Alara, and I find myself hoping you might consider making our partnership permanent, in every sense of the word. Alara felt her breath catch at the clear implication behind his words, joy and disbelief mingling within her chest as she processed the magnitude of what he was suggesting. You wish to marry me? She asked softly, scarcely daring to believe the words even as she spoke them. I wish nothing more in this world, Alaric said, his usual composure giving way entirely to open, genuine emotion. You have taught me more about genuine worth, patience, and unwavering dedication than I ever learned throughout my entire privileged upbringing. I cannot imagine building any future that does not include you fully as my equal partner in every endeavor still ahead of us. Tears fell freely now, as Alara nodded, unable to find words adequate to express the overwhelming joy filling her heart. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, I would be honored to build that future together with you. Their embrace was interrupted moments later by Nathaniel's excited voice calling from the training paddock, drawing their attention toward Ashfall, who stood proudly at the center of the enclosure, his once scarred coat now gleaming with health and vitality. surrounded by several young foals sired through his remarkable bloodline over recent months. "He seems to sense something significant has just occurred," Elara said, laughing softly through her remaining tears as she watched the magnificent stallion who had transformed both their lives so completely. "Perhaps he does," Alaric said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they walked together toward the paddock. "After everything he has taught us both about trust, patience, and the remarkable transformations possible when someone refuses to give up on what others have already dismissed as worthless." They stood together at the paddock fence, watching Ashfall move gracefully among his growing family of offspring, each one carrying forward the legendary bloodline that had nearly been lost forever, restored now through nothing more than one determined woman's refusal to abandon a broken, frightened creature that everyone else had already given up on entirely. "From an abandoned stable and a horse nobody wanted," Elara mused softly, "to this." "To everything," Alaric agreed, drawing her closer against his side. "And this is merely the beginning of what we will continue building together, for as long as we both shall live." Behind them, the stables that had once stood crumbling and forgotten now buzzed with activity and purpose. Transformed entirely from the abandoned ruin the Duke had once dismissed as worthless, into a thriving legacy that would continue for generations to come. Built upon the foundation of one woman's unwavering belief that even the most broken creatures could rise again, to achieve greatness beyond anyone's wildest expectations. As the sun set golden over Rowanfield stables that evening, casting long shadows across the newly repaired fences and thriving paddocks, Elara Whitmore stood beside the man she loved, watching the magnificent horse who had brought them together move gracefully among his offspring, knowing with absolute certainty that everything she had fought so desperately to save had blossomed into something far more extraordinary than she had ever dared imagine. On that cold morning, when strangers first arrived, threatening to take it all away, the stable that was once abandoned had become a legacy. The horse that was once broken had become a champion, and the woman who refused to give up had found not only success, but a partnership and love that would carry her forward into a future brighter than anything she could have imagined when this remarkable journey first began.